In 1964, a woman named Kitty Genovese worked as a bartender in Queens, which is one of the 5 boroughs of New York City. When the bar closed at 3 o'clock in the morning, she did her usual thing of getting in her car and driving to her nearby apartment. Unfortunately, she caught the attention of someone lurking in another car who was looking for a victim. When she arrived at her apartment, unaware that she was being followed, he suddenly caught up with her and a brutal crime took place. She was stabbed many times, shrieking, left for dead on the ground, and the man got away. Apparently, though, he came back a little bit later and raped her while finishing with more stabbing. It was a horrific crime. What made the crime newsworthy, that's newsworthy enough, right? But what made it really newsworthy was one of the writers for the New York Times picked up this story from the police blotter and investigating, and talking to the investigating policeman, he mentioned that there were 41 people in the apartment building, all who heard everything that was taking place. Not one of them picked up a telephone to call the police. Not one of them picked up a telephone to summon medical authorities. No one went out and assisted her. And this became a rather famous thing all around the United States of America. Years later, sociologists would actually add something called the Genovese effect, which speaks of why is it that bystanders do not help when help is needed. And it continues to be a premise of the bystander effect. You'll see that on the internet. There's only one problem with the story. It turns out it's somewhat inaccurate. Oh yes, she was brutally murdered. Oh yes, she was brutally raped. No doubt about that. But it turns out there were 41 people that they wanted to question, most of whom were not awake, did not know her, said they did not remember. It was actually a smaller number of people. It turns out someone called the police, and it turns out that someone called for an ambulance to come to her. So the story was, shall we say, inaccurate. But the central point certainly raises that question. What are we to do when someone we know is in desperate need? How is it that we are neighbor to them? Jesus uses the parable that I told you at the beginning we call the Good Samaritan, which is really not an accurate title for this parable. Really, the more accurate title is the Samaritan. As I mentioned, Jesus never once says in that story that anyone's good, bad, or otherwise. So let's not put words in the Lord's mouth. It's his story, it's his parable. Parables are stories. In other words, they're not news reports. We're not talking about Kitty Genovese in the New York Times. We're now speaking of Jesus using a teaching example where he creates all the elements of the story. So it starts out that there's a man going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Along the way, a robber comes up upon him, and maybe a group of them, and severely beats him, strips him of his clothing, and leaves him half dead on the ground. Not immediately, but at some point, a priest coming from Jerusalem comes and observes the man lying down on the ground, crosses to the other side, and walks by. Then comes a Levite who also comes and does the same, sees what's happening, crosses the other side of the street, and walks by. For many years, there's been all this speculation. Why did the priest walk by? Why did the Levite walk by? All of it makes me think it's like one of those bar jokes where they're going to say, a priest, a Levite, and a Samaritan walk into a bar. That's not what this story, though, is. In fact, the reason for their walking by is not supplied. Perhaps they had a fear of this being a setup and that they would be harmed themselves. It's frequently speculated that they did not want to be contaminated touching blood or a dead corpse. But the important detail of the story, they had finished their duties in Jerusalem and were returning home to Jericho. And so that can't possibly end. We don't know why they walked by, and we don't need to know why they walked by. We only need to know that they did not walk by. The next character is the Samaritan. Some of this is lost on us. So I want to tell you why Samaritans and Jews are a prominent rivalry in Jesus' time. The Samaritans came into the northern kingdom of Israel a good number of centuries before the birth of Christ. Of course, they were outsiders coming with a different kind of worship. Ultimately, the groups completely disagreed with each other about the center of worship. The Jews say that everything is worshipped at the temple in Jerusalem. By the way, they still say that. And the Samaritans, who disappeared off the face of the earth, said that where Mount Gerizim was where their worship would be. And so the two groups constantly fought against each other, were rivals with each other, didn't like each other, wanted nothing to do with each other. Throughout the gospel, the different gospels, you will hear this rivalry come up in Jesus' teaching in many different kinds of ways. But this is provocative. He's the one telling the story. A Samaritan is walking down the road where he has no business walking. So the Samaritans lived much closer to Nazareth, which is north of all this area where today's gospel took place. More importantly, he's journeying on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. What on God's earth is a Samaritan doing in Jerusalem? We're not told. He's simply in enemy territory. He's where he is not welcome. He's placing himself in danger. Note the story. The man going down the road is robbed and beaten within an inch of his life and left there. This is a dangerous stretch of road. That's clear from all the scriptural scholarship. The Samaritan happens upon him, sees him, is moved with compassion, goes to him, and then begins to address his wounds with, it says, wine and oil. He puts clothing on him, puts him on the back of his animal, and takes him to an inn, we know not how far away. And when he takes him there, he provides for his care. And he tells the innkeeper, I'm leaving you 2 silver coins, and if this isn't enough when I come back, I will pay you for these expenses. The Samaritan does the most amazing thing in helping and rescuing this man left by the side of the road. You know, to grasp this fully, because again, Samaritan and Jew doesn't really ring with us politically, just put in words red and blue. That'll work. That's a big difference that we have. If you're Republican and Democrat, you want to be old-fashioned, liberal and conservative. Who knows what those labels mean anymore? But it's the same thing as Jews and Samaritans. In fact, all of the division that's happening in our world right now can be found in that story, the story of the merciful Samaritan. We're not saying that somebody's good or bad. The priest is good, the Levite's good, the Samaritan's good. Not the point of our discussion. Who is the one that showed mercy? And Jesus asked the scholar of the law who's questioning him in the first place, what must I do to be saved? And he says, what is the law? You must love your neighbor as yourself. And then he asks Jesus, because he wants to be justified, who is my neighbor? And it's that answer, who is my neighbor, that challenges us 21 centuries later, with our own rivalries, whatever those may be, and how we treat others who are not in our tribe, not in our group, not in our immediate circle. You know, it starts with that word neighbor. I don't know about you, but growing up, I knew who my neighbors were. We lived in an area where everyone knew everyone. The neighbor was a place you could go to borrow a cup of sugar. I don't know if anybody does that anymore. But we would walk over to the empty cup and bring a cup of sugar if we were out of it, or something of that sort. The neighbors looked after all the different kids. We had umpteen million parents in my neighborhood, and therefore our neighborhood was safe. Place of harmony. I always thought of neighbors the way many people do as geographical, nearby, people that you know, people that you trust. Jesus turns all of this upside down. When he speaks of neighbor this way, he's certainly not speaking of geographical proximity. It was geographical proximity that was causing today's dispute, because the Jews and the Samaritans each believed about something about geography that the other one did not believe. And they were only interested in those in their geographic and immediate familial circles, and they were not interested in attending to the needs or attending to the interest or worrying about any other kinds of people. So I thought, what could be some deliberately provocative examples I can use to really display the dilemma when we're asked the question, who is our neighbor? And how is it that we're to be neighbor to them? Well, while I was on vacation, the Supreme Court overturned the Roe versus Wade decision, and it has caused enormous debate in the country, debate that we've been having for 50 years, for a very long time. And political argument about what type of regulation or legislation there should be regarding abortion and what were the privacy rights and all that stuff that's built into that. I think our parable tonight simplifies this for our purposes. See, Jesus once says, who is our neighbor? The abortion dilemma belongs to 3 people that we have to deal with. One is the child who is conceived in his mother's womb. That is a real person. Therefore, someone you and I must be neighbor to. In fact, all of us, a communal society, must be neighbor to the child who's in his mother's womb. But you see, that's not the end of the discussion. There happens to be a mother who has the womb that the child is in. How are we going to be neighbor to her? In the current climate, they just want her to bring the child to term and then throw them out on the unsuspecting, uncaring world, whether there's going to be support for them or not. How is that being neighbor? And almost never in the discussion the father's brought up, he is part of the equation. And whether we like it or not, whether we think that he's faithful or not, whether we think that he's good or not, is irrelevant. He is also one of the persons to which whom we need to be neighbor. You see, the political controversy dismisses the most important part, which is how is it that we're to be merciful? And we cannot forget there's a child, and we cannot forget there's a mother, and we cannot forget there is a father. I don't have an answer to this other than framing it this way, with church teaching gives us a way to see what Jesus expects of us. He does not expect a political argument. He actually expects mercy on all sides. Second example, probably even more provocative, but the debate that we're having in our states and in our country about gender fluidity, transgender. And I will confess, when I've brought it up several times, I do not have good subject matter knowledge of this phenomenon. I've not really encountered anything more than what I've read and seen on the television screen. It's a real reality, though, however, that adolescent girls and boys experience dysphoria, which is gender disconformity. And perhaps because it's more well known, it is in secret, more people are doing it, but that's a very real thing. How are we to be neighbor to the young adolescent boy, the adolescent girl who's not clear? They feel like they're not in their proper body. They feel like they're not in their right gender. How are we to be neighbor to them? Or are we neighbor to them when we say we care what swimming team you want to swim on? We don't care anything else about your psychological trauma. If we think you're a man, we want you to be on the men's swimming team. Or if we're embarrassed about the idea of the restrooms, then we won't do an accommodation that will make you feel better. How are these things being neighbor? At the same time, there are parents and family members who have very real difficulties. The issue is not easy to deal with. It does not have easy answers. In fact, it has more conflict than it has anything else. You know what? They're neighbors too, and we have to do that. So you can't just pick one side of the argument and say that's the right one and the other one is the wrong one. The reality is we're placed in something where we're not being asked to resolve the argument. We're being asked to be neighbor. And most of the ways that we react on both sides of this troubling issue and any other ones that you can think of at the moment all culminate in the question, who is our neighbor and how am I to be neighbor to them? One final twist to this merciful Samaritan story. Jesus uses these figures, the priest, the Levite, the Samaritan, to kind of animate his story. But the central event, without worrying about who's what, is someone who is vulnerable and in terrible shape and in need of the help of others. That's how we can understand that person lying on the side of the road. Most of us try to empathetically understand them, but I'm going to suggest a radically different way. The radically different way is to suddenly realize we're the one on the side of the road. You see, spiritually, the reality is that you and I are not able to construct our moral lives in such a way that we simply avoid sin altogether, so that we don't have to worry about it. The scholar of the law, what must I do to be justified? How far do I have to go? What are the edges? I've had to dime for the number of times that's been asked in confession I'd be a wealthy man. The reality is that that's not what the sin question is. The sin question, what is it that we do when we recognize that we are trapped in sins, that we must turn to the Lord for grace? You see, we all, every last one of us, are the person who's called victims to robbers. What are the robbers? Metaphorically, it's the harsh, dangerous world that we live in, with all of that partisan division and all of that shouting and all of that tribalism. You see, that is the danger of the road that we're journeying on, and none of us are immune from that danger. And as a result of it, someone needs to save us. Someone needs to rescue us. Note the elements in the story. The Samaritan pours wine and oil into the wounds. Doesn't sound very medically sound to me, but it's exactly what he did. But when you think of the Church's sacraments, for heaven's sakes, they use wine, oil used in the sacrament of healing. And this man was nourished after he was put into the inn. Bread's going to be involved in there. Do you get the idea? What Jesus is prefiguring in this parable is the Eucharist. The very Eucharist you and I are celebrating this evening. And there's only one way to celebrate the Eucharist, unworthily. Only one way to understand yourself. On the side of the road, in need of rescue, in need of help, unable to help ourselves. And time and time and time again, when we find ourselves in that position, the Lord comes and rescues us. That's the only way to understand the Eucharist we're receiving. It's the only way to understand absolution when we receive it in confession. I'm struck by regulars who come to me so very often that they're frustrated that they keep committing the same sins, as if somehow that's a standard for absolution. The Lord is more intelligent than the rest of us is. When he absolves us of our sins, he knows we're going to do it again. He knows because of the dangerous road we're traveling on. He doesn't judge us. He doesn't ask us to be good or bad. He simply rescues us because he loves us, because he's merciful. First and foremost, our God is a God of mercy. First and foremost, the Eucharist you and I celebrate tonight is an act of mercy. Lord, I am not worthy for you to enter under my roof. I do not deserve the grace you're giving, and yet time and time again, the Lord shows his mercy. But back to that question, who is my neighbor? When finally our scholar of the law recognizes that the one who helped the man left by the side of the road was the one who was neighbor, and Jesus says, go and do likewise. This command that we be neighbor to others is essential because it is the act of gratitude. You see, I believe when the man was left by the side of the road and woke up recovering in the end with someone who had taken care of him, he was grateful that someone had done this. And upon the chance to greet him again, he could thank him for everything that he had done. Don't you see? That's what Eucharist is. We are also engaging in a ritual act of thanksgiving. That's what it is. And that thanksgiving is not required. God will grace us whether we thank him or not. But that thanking him lets us be neighbor to God, who loves our offering of thanks and praise, which is the heart and soul of this Eucharist. And more importantly, for many of us who time to time in our lives question whether God really is paying attention, where God really does care, where are we left to our own devices. We're reminded in this beautiful parable that God is always neighbor to us.